Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most become the very ones who try to destroy us. My name is Isabella, and what happened at my graduation dinner changed everything I thought I knew about family, trust, and survival. It was supposed to be a celebration, one of those milestone moments where everyone gathers to toast your achievements. Instead, it became the night my boyfriend Marcus saved my life by throwing industrial cleaning solution in my mother's face. And I discovered that the woman who raised me had been planning to murder me. I can still remember sitting at that restaurant in downtown Seattle, the white tablecloths pristine, the soft jazz playing in the background. My parents had chosen this upscale place to celebrate my acceptance into a prestigious medical residency program. Everything felt perfect until Marcus stood up, his hands shaking as he pulled something from his jacket. The next few seconds unfolded in slow motion, like those moments in movies where time seems to stop. He threw the contents of a container directly at my mother's face, and suddenly her screams filled the air as her skin began to bubble and peel away. The chaos that erupted was unlike anything I've ever experienced. Diners scrambled away from our table, knocking over chairs and glasses in their panic. My father, James, immediately tackled Marcus to the ground, his fists connecting with Marcus's face over and over, while my mother, Patricia, writhed on the floor. Her hands clawed at her face as the chemical ate through her skin, and the smell, oh God, the smell was something I'll never forget. It was like burning plastic mixed with something far worse, something that made everyone within 10 feet start gagging. What Marcus shouted next, even as my father and two of my uncles pinned him down, changed everything. "She's been stealing Isabella's identity for 3 years," he yelled, blood running from his nose where my father had hit him. "She's been using their identical appearance to drain her bank accounts. I have proof. I have video of her at 5 different banks." The words didn't make sense at first. My mind couldn't process what he was saying, while my mother's inhuman screams echoed through the restaurant. But then he managed to pull out his phone, the screen cracked from the struggle, and held it up for everyone to see. "I found discrepancies when we were looking for apartments together," Marcus continued, his voice strained as my uncle twisted his arm behind his back. "I installed tracking software because something didn't add up, and I caught her. She's stolen over $40,000 from Isabella's accounts." The video on his phone showed someone who looked exactly like me at an ATM, but wearing clothes I recognized as my mother's. The way she moved, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, it was a perfect imitation of my mannerisms. My legs gave out and I collapsed into a chair, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. My mother, even through the melting flesh and blood streaming down what remained of her face, managed to speak. "Those accounts are family money," she shrieked, the words barely human through her destroyed mouth. The rage in her voice, even through the agony she must have been experiencing, sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the voice of someone caught in a lie. It was the voice of someone who truly believed they were entitled to what they'd taken. My father's hands were covered in blood and bits of my mother's dissolved skin as he grabbed Marcus's phone, staring at the screen in disbelief. "Patricia, you've been stealing from our daughter," he asked, his voice hollow with shock. The question hung in the air between my mother's screams, and her response would haunt me forever. "She owes me everything," my mother hissed, blood and tissue dripping onto the white marble floor. "I gave up my career to raise her. I sacrificed everything for her. She owes me her life." Marcus looked directly at me then, his face already swelling from the beating, and said something that made my blood run cold. "That's not why I had to destroy her face." Everyone in the restaurant seemed to freeze at those words. Even the staff who'd been frantically calling 911 stopped to listen. My mother's whimpers grew louder, more desperate, as if she knew what was coming. "Check her purse," Marcus said quietly. "Just check her purse." My father moved first, stumbling through the chaos to grab my mother's designer handbag from where it had fallen. When he dumped the contents onto a clean section of the table, a small glass vial rolled out among the lipstick and receipts. The liquid inside was clear, innocent-looking, but Marcus's next words changed everything. "That's ricin," he said, his voice deadly calm despite the blood running down his face. She was planning to poison Isabella during their mother-daughter spa weekend next week. She was going to murder her own daughter and then completely take over her life. I vomited then, right onto the expensive tablecloth, my body rejecting this horrible truth even as my mind began to piece things together. All those times my mother had insisted on knowing every detail of my life, memorizing my friends' names, studying my habits. It hadn't been maternal interest. It had been preparation. "You were supposed to die quietly," my mother screamed at me through the destruction of her face. "After you were gone, I was going to be you, live as you, graduate from medical school as you. We look identical, and nobody would have ever known the difference." Marcus managed to gasp out more details even as the police sirens grew louder outside. "She's been preparing for months. She's memorized all of Isabella's friends, recorded her voice to practice matching it. She's already redirected Isabella's mail to a private post office box, changed the emergency contacts at the medical school to only herself. She's been planning this for so long." My father dropped to his knees in the pool of blood spreading across the floor, and I saw something break in him that would never fully heal. "I had to destroy her face," Marcus said, looking at me with desperate eyes, as police officers burst through the restaurant doors with weapons drawn. "It was the only way to make sure she could never pretend to be you again. If I hadn't stopped her, you'd be dead within a week, and she'd be living your life." The officers began shouting commands, pulling Marcus away while paramedics rushed to my mother. His final words before they dragged him out would haunt me. "There's more, Isabella. Ask about your father. Ask what she's been doing to him, too." The next several hours blurred together in a nightmare of procedures and questions. The hazmat team arrived in those terrifying white suits, cordoning off the entire restaurant as a crime scene. They made us all strip down to our underwear right there, giving us paper suits to wear while they bagged our clothes as evidence. I watched them carefully seal my graduation dress, the one my mother had helped me pick out just days ago, knowing I'd never be able to look at it again without seeing her melted face. Detective Sarah Chen introduced herself as the lead investigator, her calm professionalism a lifeline in the chaos. She explained that finding ricin made this a federal case, that the FBI would be involved, that both Marcus and my mother would face serious charges. As she spoke, I kept thinking about all the warning signs I'd missed. The way my mother always insisted on having copies of all my keys, how she'd memorized my class schedule down to which seat I preferred in each lecture hall, the way she'd started styling her hair exactly like mine. At the hospital, they put me through extensive decontamination procedures, checking every inch of my skin for chemical burns. The nurses were kind, speaking in soft voices as they helped me shower with special soap multiple times. My father was in the next room going through the same process, and I could hear him asking about my mother's condition. The burn specialist who finally came to speak with us didn't sugarcoat anything. The damage to Patricia's face was extensive and permanent. She'd need dozens of surgeries over many years, and she'd never look remotely the same again. Part of me felt sick at this news, remembering the mother who had taught me to ride a bike and braided my hair for school. But another part, a part I was ashamed of, felt like this was justice. She had planned to poison me at a spa, a place where I'd be relaxed and trusting, sharing a special moment with my mother. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't reconcile it with any happy memories from my childhood. Agent David Miller from the FBI arrived at the hospital to interview me about the ricin. He explained that possession of such a poison carried severe federal charges, that they'd need to trace where she obtained it, how long she'd been planning this. His questions were thorough but gentle, and he assured me that they'd do everything possible to understand the full scope of my mother's crimes. When I asked about Marcus, he told me that while his actions had saved my life, throwing acid was still assault with a chemical weapon, and he'd face serious charges too. The drive home from the hospital felt surreal. My uncle drove while I sat in the back seat, still wearing hospital scrubs, staring at familiar streets that suddenly seemed foreign. When we reached my apartment, I found I couldn't go inside at first. Everything in there had been touched by my mother at some point. She had a key, had helped me decorate, had spent countless hours on my couch discussing my future. How many of those conversations had been her studying me, preparing to become me? Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. On my kitchen counter was a yellow envelope I definitely hadn't put there. My hands shook as I opened it to find a mail forwarding confirmation from the postal service, dated 6 days ago. My signature at the bottom was perfect, except I'd never signed it. My mother had already started redirecting my life to a post office box across town, laying the groundwork for my disappearance. I spent the rest of that night on the phone with banks and credit card companies, each call revealing more violation. The customer service representatives were patient as I sobbed through security questions, discovering account after account I'd never opened. The theft totaled over $50,000, but the financial violation felt minor compared to everything else. She'd been funding her plan to murder me with money stolen from my future. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten my number. The restaurant attack had been filmed by multiple diners, and the videos were already viral. I watched one against my better judgment and saw myself frozen in shock while my mother's face melted and Marcus screamed the truth about her plans. The comments ranged from calling Marcus a hero to saying we all deserved what we got. I deactivated all my social media accounts, unable to handle strangers dissecting the worst moment of my life. Detective Chen called the next morning asking me to come to the station. She had something to show me that Marcus had given them, security footage he'd collected over months of suspicion. The first video showed my mother at an ATM, wearing my clothes and perfectly mimicking my movements. The second showed her practicing my signature at her kitchen table, filling pages with my name until she got it exactly right. But the third video was the one that broke something inside me forever. It showed my mother in my father's study, carefully crushing pills and mixing them into his coffee. She stirred patiently until the powder dissolved completely, then put the mug on his desk with a loving smile. Another clip from a different day showed her switching his blood pressure medication with sleeping pills, pouring his real medicine down the sink while humming softly to herself. Marcus had documented 6 different incidents over 2 months, creating a clear pattern of my mother drugging my father without his knowledge. No wonder he always seemed so tired, I whispered, remembering years of my father's increasing confusion and fatigue that we'd attributed to work stress and aging. Detective Chen nodded grimly and showed me a spreadsheet Marcus had created, tracking my father's symptoms against the drugging incidents. The correlation was perfect. On days when my mother gave him higher doses, my father could barely stay awake through dinner. She'd been controlling him through chemistry, keeping him docile and unaware while she pursued her plans. The detective had more to show me. Records from 5 different pharmacies showed my mother filling prescriptions for my father, using 3 different doctors who had never actually seen him. She'd forged his signature and paid cash to avoid insurance records, rotating between pharmacies so no one would notice the pattern. The sheer scale of her deception was staggering. This wasn't a recent development or a mental break. This had been going on for years. I went to see my father at his hotel room that evening. He'd refused to go back to the house he'd shared with my mother, and I couldn't blame him. We sat together on the small couch, both of us trying to process revelations that rewrote our entire family history. He told me about feeling like he'd been living in a fog for the past 2 years, how he'd even Googled early onset dementia symptoms because he was so worried about his memory problems. All along, it had been my mother poisoning him to keep him compliant. The hospital ran comprehensive blood work on him, and the results were terrifying. He had dangerous levels of 3 different sedatives in his system, none of which had been prescribed by his actual doctor. His real blood pressure had been dangerously high for months because he wasn't getting his proper medication. The doctors started a careful withdrawal protocol, warning us that stopping the drugs too quickly could cause seizures or worse. My mother had made him physically dependent on her poison cocktail. 3 days later, my father had his first seizure. I was with him when it happened, watching TV and trying to pretend things were normal when suddenly he started convulsing. The medical team rushed in and all I could do was stand in the corner crying while they worked to save him. He survived, but the doctor said there would likely be more seizures as his body adjusted to functioning without the constant sedation. My mother had done this to him, had chosen to slowly destroy the man she'd married rather than risk him interfering with her plans. Detective Chen called with updates on the ricin investigation. They'd found receipts in my mother's files for castor beans purchased online over 6 months, all bought with prepaid credit cards and shipped to that secret post office box. She'd researched extraction methods extensively, checking out chemistry textbooks from libraries across the city to avoid creating a digital trail. In her garage, they found the equipment she'd used: a coffee grinder, filters, protective gear, everything needed to extract the deadly poison from those innocent-looking beans. The most disturbing discovery was a locked filing cabinet containing detailed notes about her experiments. She'd been testing the ricin on mice purchased from pet stores, carefully documenting dosages and death times. She'd even researched which autopsy tests might detect ricin and had planned to push for my cremation to destroy any evidence. The level of premeditation was staggering. This wasn't a crime of passion or a mental break. This was months of careful, deliberate planning to murder her own daughter. The prosecutor assigned to Marcus's case, Jennifer Walsh, met with me to discuss his charges. She explained that despite his actions saving my life, throwing acid was aggravated assault at minimum. The fact that he'd planned it, bringing the chemical to the restaurant deliberately, made it worse in the eyes of the law. But she also said the circumstances were extraordinary and they were willing to discuss plea deals that acknowledged his motivations. I felt so conflicted, grateful to be alive, but horrified by what he'd done to achieve it. I decided I needed to see Marcus, despite everyone advising against it. The jail visiting room was cold and sterile, with scratched plexiglass separating us and phones that reeked of disinfectant. He looked terrible, thin and bruised, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look like a stranger. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears, and he pressed his hand against the glass. I wanted to hate him for what he'd done, for the violence of it, but I couldn't. Not when I knew I'd be dead without his intervention. He told me about following my mother for weeks after noticing discrepancies in my bank statements during our apartment search. How he'd installed hidden cameras when she mentioned having a key to my place, hoping to catch her stealing. Instead, he'd discovered something far worse. He showed me, through his lawyer, more footage he'd collected. My mother practicing my voice for hours, recording herself saying my most common phrases until she got them perfect. Videos of her at my apartment when I wasn't home, going through my closets, and taking photos of how I organized things. The worst video was from a week before the attack. It showed my mother on the phone with the spa, confirming our reservation and asking about private dining options. She specifically requested a suite with a kitchenette, saying I had dietary restrictions and she wanted to prepare our meals herself. On the same call, she mentioned I might extend my stay for some alone time after graduation stress and could they arrange for a late checkout. She was creating a window where no one would look for me, where she could dispose of my body and begin her transformation into me. Marcus's lawyer, Daniel Morrison, explained their defense strategy while Marcus listened silently. They would argue extreme emotional distress and defense of others, emphasizing that Marcus genuinely believed I was in imminent danger. The security footage and evidence of the ricin plot would be crucial. Daniel thought they could get the charges reduced significantly, maybe even to simple assault with time served, but there were no guarantees. The prosecutor had to consider the severity of my mother's injuries and the public nature of the attack. During our visit, Marcus asked me something that haunted me for weeks. Did you ever wonder why she pushed so hard for you to go to medical school? When I shook my head, confused, he continued, think about it. A doctor has access to things, knows things. She wasn't living through you, Isabella. She was preparing to live as you, and a doctor can disappear problems much easier than a regular person. The implication made me physically ill. How long had she been planning this? Had every moment of support, every push towards success been part of her twisted plan? I left the jail feeling hollower than before. The victim's advocate, Nancy Rodriguez, met me at a coffee shop afterward, helping me process the visit. She reminded me that feeling grateful to Marcus, while also being traumatized by his violence, was normal, that I didn't owe him forgiveness just because he'd saved me. She helped me see that both things could be true. He'd saved my life, and he'd committed a violent crime. I could appreciate one while still holding him accountable for the other. The financial investigation revealed even more violations. My mother had been filing tax returns in my name for years, claiming refunds that went to accounts I didn't know existed. She'd applied for student loans I never needed, pocketing the money while saddling me with debt. The IRS agent assigned to my case said it would take years to fully untangle the fraud. Every agency I dealt with expressed shock at the sophistication of the identity theft. This wasn't typical family fraud. This was a comprehensive attempt to take over another person's existence. 3 weeks after the attack, I attended my mother's arraignment. She was wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair, her entire head wrapped in white bandages, with only small openings for her eyes and mouth. When she saw me, those eyes burned with such hatred that I actually stepped back. Even facing decades in prison, even with her face destroyed beyond repair, she radiated pure malice toward me. When asked to enter a plea, she said not guilty in a voice made rough by surgeries and screaming. Her lawyer tried to argue for reduced bail, but the judge, having reviewed the evidence, kept it at $5 million. After the hearing, her court-appointed attorney approached me. He said my mother wanted to speak with me, that she had things to say that I needed to hear. Fused immediately, but he persisted, saying she claimed there were things about my childhood I didn't know, secrets that would change how I saw everything. Nancy stepped in then, telling him that any communication would go through proper channels, that my mother had lost the right to demand my attention when she plotted my murder. My father filed for divorce the same week, along with a restraining order based on the drugging. The papers were served to my mother in the hospital, and apparently she flew into such a rage that they had to sedate her. She managed to write several letters before the restraining order was fully in place, each one more vicious than the last. In them, she called my father weak and pathetic, said I'd poisoned him against her, promised to destroy both of us when she got out. The letters were entered as evidence and only strengthened the case against her. The medical bills started arriving, and the numbers were staggering. My mother's care would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and since my father was still legally her husband, he was responsible until the divorce was finalized. Insurance covered some, but the specialized surgeries she needed were often considered cosmetic and were denied. It felt like adding insult to injury, being financially responsible for treating the wounds inflicted while she tried to murder me. Detective Chen uncovered more disturbing evidence as the investigation continued. My mother had joined online forums for people with identical twins, studying how they could switch places undetected. She'd researched cases of identity theft between family members, looking for what mistakes to avoid. Her browser history showed hundreds of searches about how long bodies took to decompose, how to delay discovery of a death, what poisons were hardest to detect. She'd been planning my murder for at least a year, maybe longer. The support group for family members of violent crime victims became my lifeline during this time. Sitting in that circle of folding chairs in a church basement, I found people who understood the particular horror of being betrayed by someone who was supposed to love you. There was a woman whose son had tried to burn down her house with her inside, a man whose brother had stabbed him over inheritance money, others with stories just as shocking as mine. We shared the unique grief of losing family members who were still alive, who had chosen violence over love. 4 months she warned me that my mother's defense would likely claim mental illness, that they'd try to paint her as a devoted mother who snapped under pressure. We practiced my testimony over and over, making sure I could deliver the facts without breaking down. The truth was damning enough without emotional embellishment. But 3 days before the trial was set to begin, my mother surprised everyone by accepting a plea deal. 15 years in federal prison for the attempted murder charge, with additional state charges for identity theft and fraud to be served concurrently. She'd have to serve at least 10 years before being eligible for parole. When asked if she understood the terms, she said yes in that destroyed voice, then asked to make a statement. The judge allowed it, and what she said next showed no remorse at all. "I gave up everything for my daughter," she said, each word careful despite her damaged mouth. "I sacrificed my career, my dreams, my entire life to raise her. I made her who she is, and she owes me everything. I don't apologize for trying to take what was rightfully mine. I only regret failing." The courtroom was silent after her words, even her own attorney looking uncomfortable. The judge accepted the plea, but added his own comments about the severity of her crimes and the complete lack of remorse shown. After all the legal proceedings ended, I was left to rebuild my life. The medical school had held my spot, understanding the extraordinary circumstances, but returning to classes felt impossible at first. How could I concentrate on anatomy when I kept thinking about my mother researching poisons? How could I study healing when I'd seen such deliberate harm? But slowly, with therapy and support, I began to reclaim my dreams. My mother had tried to steal my future, but she'd failed. I wouldn't let her win by giving up on my own ambitions. My father and I grew closer through our shared trauma. As the drugs left his system and his real personality emerged, I got to know him in ways my mother's control had never allowed. He was funnier than I'd realized, with opinions and interests my mother had suppressed for years. We started having weekly dinners where we talked about everything except her, slowly building a relationship that wasn't defined by her absence. He even started dating eventually, cautiously, with someone who knew our whole story and accepted the baggage we carried. The financial recovery took years. Even after the criminal cases were resolved, I had to dispute fraudulent accounts, rebuild my credit, and constantly monitor for new theft attempts. My mother had scattered financial landmines throughout my life, and they kept exploding long after she was imprisoned. But each small victory, each account closed, each debt discharged, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I became an expert in identity theft recovery, knowledge I never wanted but desperately needed. I visited Marcus once more before he was transferred to serve his sentence. He'd used his time in county jail to write a letter to my mother that he wanted me to read. In it, he expressed no regret for stopping her, but genuine sorrow for the pain he'd caused. He wrote about watching someone he loved being slowly destroyed and feeling helpless to stop it through normal channels. He knew the acid was wrong, he admitted, but faced with the certainty of my death, he'd chosen violence to save me. I couldn't forgive him entirely, but I understood. My mother served her sentence in a federal facility 3 states away. I received updates through the victim notification system, but chose not to visit or communicate with her. She sent letters occasionally, forwarded through proper channels, but I had Nancy screen them first. They never contained apologies or explanations, just more vitriol and promises of revenge. Eventually, I had them automatically destroyed upon receipt. She'd lost the privilege of taking up space in my mind. Years passed, and the acute trauma faded into a dull ache that flared up at unexpected moments. A woman with similar hair in a grocery store could trigger a panic attack. The smell of certain cleaning products made me nauseous. Mother's Day became a minefield of complicated emotions, but I learned to manage these triggers, to build a life around the damage without letting it define me. I graduated from medical school, started my residency, fell in love with someone new who understood why I might never want a traditional wedding reception. The news of my mother's first parole hearing came 8 years after the attack. She was denied, partly due to her continued lack of remorse, and partly because I submitted a victim impact statement detailing the ongoing effects of her crimes. The board noted her disturbing behavior in prison, including attempts to gather information about me through other inmates. She'd apparently been bragging about her planned crime, showing no understanding of its wrongness even after years of incarceration. Marcus was released after serving 5 years, his sentence reduced for good behavior and successful completion of all required programs. He sent a letter through Nancy, not asking for forgiveness or contact, just letting me know he was out and would stay away. He'd apparently become a counselor for at-risk youth, channeling his protective instincts into healthier outlets. I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety knowing he was free, but he kept his word and never attempted contact. The final letter I received about my mother came from the prison chaplain 10 years after the attack. She'd been diagnosed with an aggressive cancer, likely related to complications from her injuries and multiple surgeries. She had months to live and had requested to see me one last time. I agonized over the decision for weeks, talking it through in therapy and with my father. In the end, I chose not to go. She'd had my entire childhood to be a real mother and had chosen violence instead. I owed her nothing, not even a goodbye. Patricia died in prison 6 months later, taking any explanations or apologies to her grave. The warden called to inform me, offering condolences that felt hollow given the circumstances. I didn't attend the funeral my father arranged, a small service with only a few distant relatives who still felt obligated to show respect. He went, he told me later, not to mourn the woman who'd drugged him and tried to murder me, but to close that chapter of his life definitively. Going through her belongings that the prison returned was surreal. Among standard items were notebooks filled with her obsessive writings about me, even from prison. Pages of plans for what she'd do when released, how she'd find me, how she'd finish what she started. The delusion had never broken, even facing death. She'd gone to her grave believing I owed her my life, my identity, everything I was. The notebooks went straight to the FBI in case they contained threats to others. Today, more than a decade later, I can talk about what happened without falling apart. The story still shocks people, and I'm selective about who I share it with. Some details I keep private, protecting the parts of my pain that don't belong to anyone else. I've built a career I love, maintained relationships with friends who stood by me, created a life my mother never could have imagined because it's authentically mine, not a performance or preparation for something else. My father remarried a wonderful woman who makes him laugh and never questions his medication choices. He's healthier at 70 than he was at 55, free from the chemical fog my mother kept him under. We joke sometimes that we're both survivors of the same woman, though the laughter always has an edge to it. He keeps a photo from my medical school graduation on his mantle, the celebration my mother tried to destroy, proof that we survived and thrived despite her. The scars remain, physical and emotional. Marcus's choice to throw acid saved my life but destroyed another, even if that life belonged to someone who planned to murder me. The violence of that solution haunts me sometimes. The knowledge that I'm alive because someone chose to maim another human being. But I've made peace with the complexity of that truth. Sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. Sometimes survival comes at a terrible cost. I think about the what-ifs more than I probably should. What if Marcus had called the police instead? What if he'd confronted my mother privately? What if he'd simply told me what he'd discovered and let me handle it? Would I be alive? Would my mother have found another way? Would the poison have been in my coffee one morning with no dramatic reveal? There's no way to know, and dwelling on alternatives to trauma doesn't change what actually happened. The story usually comes out eventually in romantic relationships, an explanation for why I'm cautious about sharing keys, why I monitor my bank accounts obsessively, why Mother's Day makes me quiet and withdrawn. Some people can't handle the weight of it, and I don't blame them. It's a heavy truth to carry that someone who should have loved me most wanted me dead. But others understand that surviving something terrible doesn't make you broken. Just careful with your trust. I've become an advocate for identity theft victims, especially those betrayed by family members. The financial violation is just the surface of a deeper wound, the knowledge that someone who knew you intimately used that knowledge as a weapon. I speak at conferences sometimes, sharing resources for recovery and pushing for better legal protections. My mother's crime gave me a mission I never wanted, but feel compelled to pursue. People sometimes ask if I forgive her, as if forgiveness is the inevitable endpoint of healing. I don't, and I don't feel guilty about that anymore. Forgiveness isn't required for moving forward. I've released the active hatred that once consumed me, but I won't pretend she deserves absolution. She made hundreds of choices over months and years, each one prioritizing her desires over my life. That's not forgivable, and pretending otherwise would be another form of self-betrayal. What happened at that restaurant changed the trajectory of multiple lives. A graduation dinner became a crime scene. A celebration became a revelation. Love revealed itself as possession, protection manifested as violence, and family showed its darkest possibilities. But I survived it all. I survived my mother's betrayal and Marcus's brutal salvation. I survived the legal system and the financial ruin and the public scrutiny. I survived, and that's enough. The woman in the mirror looks like my mother sometimes, especially as I age. We shared features that made her deception possible, that identical appearance she planned to exploit. But I style my hair differently now, dress in colours she never wore, carry myself with a confidence she could never have faked because it comes from surviving her. I look like her, but I am not her. I never was, despite her attempts to erase the distinction. This story doesn't have a clean ending because life rarely provides those. There's no moment of triumph, no final confrontation where understanding dawns. There's just the daily work of living, of choosing to trust people despite knowing how badly trust can be betrayed, of building relationships while maintaining boundaries, of pursuing dreams that someone tried to steal. It's not inspirational or uplifting. It's just survival, messy and complicated and mine. If you've made it this far, you might be wondering why I'm sharing this now, why I'm putting these words out into the world for strangers to hear. Maybe it's because silence felt like letting her win, even in death. Maybe it's because someone out there needs to know that surviving family betrayal is possible, even when that betrayal is attempted murder. Or maybe it's simply time to stop carrying this story alone, to let others help hold its weight for a while. Whatever the reason, this is my truth. My mother tried to steal my life, planning my murder with the same attention to detail she once used to plan my birthday parties. My boyfriend saved me through violence that haunts us both. My father and I rebuilt our family from the ashes of betrayal. I carry scars you can't see, and debts that weren't mine, and a wariness that might never fully fade. But I also carry strength forged in survival, relationships tested by trauma, and a life that's entirely my own. Thank you for listening, for witnessing this piece of my story. May you never need the strength that comes from surviving those who should have loved you. May your trust be well placed and your family bonds genuine. And if you're carrying your own story of betrayal and survival, know that you're not alone. We're out here, the survivors of family violence, building lives from broken pieces and finding beauty in our resilience. That's all any of us can do, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one breath at a time. The journey of healing isn't linear, and I want to share more about what those years really looked like, because I think that's where the real story lives. Not in the dramatic moment of revelation, but in the quiet hours afterward when you have to figure out how to keep breathing. In those first weeks after the attack, I couldn't eat properly. Everything tasted like chemicals, like the burning smell from that restaurant. My Aunt Linda would come over with soup, sitting with me while I forced down a few spoonfuls, never pushing but always present. Sleep became my enemy and my escape. When I could finally fall asleep, the nightmares were vivid and relentless. Sometimes I dreamed I was at the spa with my mother, feeling relaxed and happy, until I realized the tea she handed me was steaming with poison. Other times, I dreamed I was looking in the mirror and my mother's face stared back, her voice coming from my mouth, telling me she'd already won. I'd wake up gasping, checking my face in the bathroom mirror, reassuring myself that I was still me. The process of reclaiming my identity went beyond financial recovery. I had to relearn who I was without her influence, without her constant presence shaping my decisions. It sounds strange, but I didn't know what kind of music I actually liked because she'd always controlled what played in our house. I spent hours listening to different genres, discovering that I loved jazz and blues, music she'd called depressing and inappropriate. Small rebellions became acts of self-discovery. My therapist, Dr. Catherine Wells, became a crucial guide through this process. She specialized in trauma from family violence and had this way of asking questions that unlocked things I didn't even know I was carrying. In one session, she asked me to describe a happy memory with my mother without any commentary, just the facts of what happened. I told her about a day at the beach when I was 7, building sandcastles while my mother read a book nearby. Then she asked me to tell it again, but this time noticing things I might have overlooked. That's when I remembered that my mother had been taking photos of me the entire time, dozens and dozens of them, getting frustrated when I didn't pose exactly right. She'd made me rebuild the same sandcastle 3 times to get the perfect shot. What I'd remembered as a happy beach day was actually a photo shoot where I was the unwitting model. Dr. Wells helped me see that my mother had been studying me, collecting me, long before her final plan took shape. The victim support group became my anchor during the hardest days. There was Margaret, whose husband had tried to poison her slowly with antifreeze in her coffee, discovered only when she went to the hospital for unexplained kidney problems. She understood the particular horror of realizing someone had been hurting you secretly while smiling to your face. There was James, whose sister had burned down his business because she felt he owed her for imagined childhood slights. We bonded over the exhaustion of explaining to people that, yes, family members really could be capable of such calculated cruelty. One woman in the group, Helen, had survived an attack by her adult son, who believed she'd stolen his life by giving birth to him. The parallels to my situation were eerie, and we often stayed after meetings to talk. She told me something that stuck with me through the years. She said the hardest part wasn't the physical attack or even the betrayal, but the way it made her question every memory, wondering what was real affection and what was manipulation. That validation of my own experience meant everything. I threw myself into understanding the psychology behind what my mother had done, not to excuse it, but to make sense of it for my own sanity. I read about narcissistic personality disorder, about enmeshed family dynamics, about identity theft within families. The more I learned, the more I recognized patterns from my childhood, the way she'd insisted on us having matching outfits well into my teenage years. How she'd been furious when I cut my hair short in college without telling her first, the time she'd practiced my signature for hours, claiming she needed to sign permission slips quickly. My relationship with food became complicated after learning about the poisoning plot. For months, I could only eat things I'd prepared myself, watching every step of the process. Restaurant meals were impossible because I couldn't see the kitchen. Even accepting a cup of coffee from a friend required deep breathing exercises to calm my racing heart. Dr. Wells worked with me on exposure therapy, starting with accepting sealed bottles of water from others and slowly working up to full meals. It took almost a year before I could enjoy food without fear again. The financial fraud investigation revealed layers of deception that went back to my 18th birthday. My mother had opened a credit card in my name that very day, using it for small purchases to build credit she could exploit later. She'd been playing a long game from the moment I became a legal adult, setting up the framework for identity theft while still playing the role of supportive mother. Every birthday card with cash had been funded by debt in my name. Every gift came with invisible strings attached to accounts I didn't know existed. Returning to medical school felt like climbing a mountain with weights on my shoulders. My classmates had moved on to clinical rotations while I was stuck repeating coursework, trying to focus on anatomy while my mind kept drifting to the anatomy of betrayal. Some professors treated me with kid gloves, which I hated. Others acted like nothing had happened, which was almost worse. I found my place with a study group of other non-traditional students who understood that life sometimes derails your plans in spectacular ways. There was one professor, Dr. Michael Chen, who became an unexpected mentor. He'd seen the news coverage and approached me after class one day, not to pry, but to share his own story of family trauma. His brother had embezzled funds from their parents' business, destroying their retirement and fracturing the family. He understood the shame that comes with public family dysfunction, the way people look at you differently when they know your story. He helped me navigate the academic world while carrying this weight. Dating became a minefield I avoided for the first 2 years. The thought of trusting someone with access to my space, my routines, my vulnerabilities felt impossible. When I finally went on a date with a fellow resident named David, I spent the entire dinner analysing his every gesture for signs of deception. He asked for a second date, and I said yes, then spent a week in therapy discussing whether I was ready. Dr. Wells reminded me that hypervigilance was a normal trauma response, but I couldn't let it steal my chance at genuine connection. David and I dated for 6 months before I told him the full story. We were at his apartment, cooking dinner together, when he asked why I always insisted on separate bank accounts and why I'd never given him a key to my place. I'd prepared for this moment, but the words still stuck in my throat. He listened without interrupting, his face cycling through shock, horror, and anger on my behalf. When I finished, he asked only one question. What do you need from me to feel safe? Not why didn't you tell me sooner or how could a mother do that? Just what did I need? That relationship didn't last, not because of my trauma, but because we grew in different directions as residents often do. But it taught me that I could be vulnerable again, that not everyone would use intimate knowledge as a weapon. Each relationship after that got a little easier, though I always told my story earlier than most people share such deep truths. Better to know up front if someone could handle the weight of my history. The parole hearings became a ritual of reopening wounds. Every few years, I'd have to write a victim impact statement detailing how the crime still affected me. The parole board wanted current information, proof that my mother's actions had lasting consequences worthy of continued incarceration. I hated reducing my ongoing healing to bullet points for strangers to judge, but I did it anyway. Each time, victim services would report back that she showed no remorse, often claiming I'd orchestrated everything to steal her life. My mother's prison behavior reports painted a picture of someone who never accepted reality. She'd formed a group of followers among other inmates, telling them she was a victim of an ungrateful daughter who'd conspired with a violent boyfriend to destroy her. She'd been disciplined multiple times for trying to get information about me through visitors, offering commissary money to anyone who could find out where I lived or worked. Even behind bars, she was still trying to reach me, still convinced I owed her something. The therapy work deepened over the years, moving from crisis management to deeper healing. We explored how my mother's behavior had shaped my sense of self, how her constant mirroring had made it hard for me to know where she ended, and I began. I discovered I'd been unconsciously choosing clothes she'd hate, foods she'd never eat, friends she wouldn't approve of, still defining myself in opposition to her years after the attack. True freedom meant choosing things because I wanted them, not because they were different from her preferences. One breakthrough came when Dr. Wells asked me to write a letter to my childhood self, the little girl who'd trusted her mother completely. I sobbed through the entire exercise, telling that small version of me that the confusing feelings she had, the sense that something wasn't quite right, despite all the expressions of love, were valid. That little girl had known something was wrong but had no framework for understanding a mother who could smile while planning destruction. I grieved for the child who'd lost not just safety, but the ability to trust her own instincts. My father's recovery paralleled mine in many ways, though we rarely discussed it directly. He started seeing his own therapist to process not just the drugging, but decades of subtle control he'd never recognized. He told me once that the hardest part was accepting that the woman he'd loved had never really existed, that he'd been married to a carefully constructed persona designed to give my mother access to resources and respectability. His grief was complicated by relief, his anger tempered by shame that he hadn't protected me. We developed new traditions to replace the tainted ones. Thanksgiving became a potluck with chosen family instead of my mother's rigid formal dinners. My birthday was celebrated with trips to places she'd never taken me, experiencing things she would have called frivolous or inappropriate. Each new tradition was an act of reclamation, building a life she couldn't have imagined, because it wasn't focused on control or appearances, but on genuine joy. The medical career I'd fought so hard to preserve became a source of healing in unexpected ways. Working in emergency medicine, I saw families in crisis every day. Sometimes I recognized the signs others might miss: the controlling partner who answered all the questions, the adult child who flinched when their parent moved too quickly. I couldn't save everyone, but I could ensure that resources were offered, that suspicions were documented, that victims knew someone saw them. One case hit particularly close to home. A young woman came in with suspicious injuries, her mother hovering nearby with explanations that didn't quite fit. The daughter's eyes held that familiar look of someone trapped between loyalty and survival. I made sure she was seen alone, following protocol, but also speaking from a place of deep understanding. She didn't disclose anything that day, but she took the resource card I slipped her, and I saw her again months later, free and healing. We never spoke of it directly, but she knew I knew, and sometimes that's enough. My mother's death in prison should have felt like closure, but it was more complicated than that. Part of me had imagined some deathbed revelation, a moment of clarity where she'd finally understand what she'd done. Instead, she died clutching her delusions, still convinced I was the villain in her story. The prison chaplain who'd contacted me sent one final letter describing her last days. Even facing death, she'd ranted about my ingratitude and promised that someone would avenge her. The sickness that drove her never lifted. Cleaning out the storage unit where her belongings had been kept while my father decided what to do with them was surreal. Boxes of photos showing our apparent closeness, mother-daughter matching outfits, smiling faces at school events. Anyone looking at them would see a devoted mother and beloved daughter. Only I could see the performance of it all, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. The possessive grip disguised as affection in every embrace. Among her things, I found journals dating back to my birth. The early entries seemed normal enough, a new mother documenting milestones and expressing typical frustrations. But around my 5th birthday, the tone shifted. She wrote about feeling like I was stealing her youth, her opportunities, her very self. By the time I was 10, she was writing about deserving my life more than I did. The progression from resentment to entitlement to planning was documented in her own hand, a roadmap of dysfunction I'd lived through without understanding. I kept one photo from that storage unit, one where I was about 3 years old, laughing on a swing with genuine joy while she pushed me. It might have been real, that moment. Or maybe she was already cataloguing my laugh for future mimicry. I'll never know, and I've made peace with that ambiguity. The photo sits in a drawer, not displayed but not discarded, a reminder that even the most toxic relationships contain moments that might have been love. Marcus and I never spoke again after his release, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd built a quiet life teaching self-defense and working with at-risk youth. He'd channeled his protective instincts into healthier outlets, helping others recognize danger and respond appropriately. I hoped he'd found peace with his choices, as I'd found peace with mine. We were both survivors of that night in different ways, both paying prices we never should have had to pay. The advocacy work grew from personal necessity into genuine passion. I started speaking at conferences about family identity theft, pushing for better legal protections and resources for victims. The laws are slowly changing, recognizing that family members can be predators too, that shared DNA doesn't guarantee safety. Every small victory in legislation felt like honoring not just my own survival, but all the others who'd contacted me over the years with similar stories. The letters and emails from other survivors became an unexpected source of purpose. They'd find my story online or hear me speak and reach out, desperate to be believed and understood. Many were still trapped in abusive situations, afraid to act, because who would believe such an outlandish story about their own parent or sibling or child? I always believed them. Knew firsthand how far family could go when love twisted into something monstrous. One young man wrote about discovering his father had been slowly poisoning his mother while setting him up to take the blame. Another woman found out her twin sister had been living as her in another state, ruining her credit and reputation. The variations were endless, but the core betrayal was the same. Family using intimacy as a weapon, trust as a tool for destruction. I couldn't save them all, but I could offer resources, validation, and proof that survival was possible. 10 years after the attack, I returned to that restaurant. It had been remodeled, the layout completely different, but I needed to see the space again. The manager, who'd been a server that night, recognized me immediately. He told me they'd never really recovered from what happened, that many staff members still had nightmares. I apologized for bringing violence into their space, though I knew it wasn't my fault. He said what haunted him most wasn't the attack itself, but my mother's words, the casual way she'd admitted to planning murder while her face dissolved. Standing in that transformed space, I felt the weight of how many lives had been altered by my mother's choices. The restaurant workers who'd witnessed horror during their shift. The other diners whose celebrations were forever tainted. The first responders who'd had to process a scene unlike anything in their training. The ripples of her violence extended far beyond our family, touching strangers who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The financial recovery took a full decade to complete. Even after all the fraud was documented and disputed, the credit reporting agencies were slow to remove every trace. I became an expert at reading credit reports, spotting discrepancies, filing disputes. My credit score, once destroyed by her theft, slowly climbed back to respectable levels. Each point increase felt like a small victory, tangible proof that her damage wasn't permanent. I never remarried, though I had several meaningful relationships over the years. The intimacy of marriage, the legal entangling of lives and finances, felt too vulnerable after what I'd experienced. My partners understood, or they didn't last. I built a different kind of life, rich with friendships and chosen family, professional accomplishments, and personal growth. Not the life I'd planned at 21, but one shaped by survival into something uniquely mine. My father passed away 5 years ago, finally free from the physical effects of her drugging, but never quite recovering from the emotional betrayal. He'd found happiness in his final years, remarrying a wonderful woman who brought lightness back into his life. At his funeral, I spoke about his resilience, his ability to trust again after such deception. I didn't mention my mother, but her absence was a presence in itself, the family member whose actions had accelerated his aging and complicated his final years. Going through his papers after his death, I found letters he'd written to me but never sent during the worst of the crisis. Pages of apology for not protecting me, for not seeing what was happening under his own roof. His guilt was palpable in every line, though I'd told him repeatedly it wasn't his fault. Predators are skilled at hiding, especially when they wear the mask of love. He'd been a victim too, chemically controlled and emotionally manipulated for years. His letters revealed the depth of his struggle to forgive himself for something that was never his responsibility. Today, at 45, I've built a life my mother never could have imagined because it wasn't built on control or performance, but on authenticity and connection. My small medical practice serves a community that knows pieces of my story and trusts me more because of it. They know I understand that danger can come from anywhere, that survival takes many forms, that healing is possible but not always pretty. I still check my bank accounts more than necessary. I still freeze at certain sounds or smells that transport me back to that restaurant. I still have moments where I catch my reflection and see her face superimposed over mine. The hypervigilance has faded, but never fully disappeared. These are the prices of survival, the ongoing costs of staying alive when someone who should have loved you wanted you dead. But there's beauty in this broken life too. Deep friendships forged through shared truth. The ability to recognize and validate others' pain because I've walked similar paths. Professional success that means more because I almost lost the chance to achieve it. Small daily joys that feel profound because I know how close I came to never experiencing them again. A life built consciously, choice by choice, in defiance of someone else's plan to erase me. Sometimes young women reach out after hearing my story, terrified that their own mothers seem too interested in their lives, too invested in their achievements. Most of the time, it's just enmeshment or empty nest syndrome, not attempted murder. But I always listen carefully, always validate their instincts to pay attention when something feels wrong. Because sometimes it is wrong, catastrophically wrong, and dismissing those feelings could be fatal. The advocacy work continues, pushing for better systems to protect victims of family fraud and violence. I've testified before legislative committees, sharing the uncomfortable truth that family can be the most dangerous threat we face. The laws are slowly changing, recognizing the unique vulnerabilities created by familial relationships, the way trust and access combine to create perfect conditions for predation. Each small legal victory feels like building a fence between potential victims and the family members who would harm them. I think about the alternate timeline sometimes, the different ways this could have ended. If Marcus hadn't noticed the financial discrepancies during our apartment hunt, if he'd chosen to call the police instead of taking violent action, if my mother had been more patient, waiting until after the spa trip to start using my identity. The fragility of my survival haunts me sometimes. How many small coincidences had to align for me to be sitting here today, alive and telling this story? But I am here, against odds I couldn't have calculated. Scarred but not broken, cautious but not closed off, changed by trauma but not defined by it. My mother tried to steal my life, and in the end, she gave me a different one. Not the life I'd planned, but one forged in survival and shaped by conscious choice. Life that's mine in ways it never could have been if she'd remained the mother I thought I knew. The sun sets now on days that belong to me alone, not shadowed by someone else's twisted dreams. I am Isabella, daughter of a woman who tried to become me, saved by a man whose love manifested as violence, survivor of the unthinkable. This is my story, and despite everything, I'm still here to tell it. That's more than enough. That's everything.